What was Elisha's response to King Jehoram's threat of death? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Kings on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 to 8. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Kings chapter 7, beginning at verse 1. Then Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." So an officer on whose hand the king leaned answered the man of God and said, "Look, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" And he said, "In fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." Now there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, "Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore, come, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall only die." And they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. And when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army. So they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us." Therefore they arose and fled at twilight, and left the camp intact, their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, and they fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they went into one tent, and ate and drank, and carried from it silver and gold and clothing, and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent, and carried some from there also, and went and hid it. As we have said numerous times before, chapters and verses were not present when the books of the Bible were originally written. They were added later by men in order to make it easier to read. However, because they are added by men, sometimes the chapter breaks are in some rather peculiar places. Such is the case here, for at the end of chapter 6, we have a Syrian siege of Samaria described to us. It was so bad that some of the Israelites in Samaria had resorted to cannibalism. King Jehoram was angry with God over this and blamed Elisha, ordering him killed. However, when the king arrived, he gave Elisha one last chance to save his life, and Elisha's response is what we get at the beginning of chapter 7, which in my opinion should have been verses 34 and 35 of chapter 6. Why this was separated from chapter 6, I don't know, but it was, and so if we're in the habit of reading one chapter a day, it can be confusing by starting chapter 7 with something that should have been at the end of chapter 6. Elisha's response to the king is basically that the siege would end. Now yes, Elisha wasn't explicit in this, but remember, there was a famine in Samaria because of the siege. The siege had caused what food remained, including unclean animals, to be sold at exorbitant prices. Elisha said that these prices would fall, and what would be sold would be flour and barley, signifying the famine would be over. Now Jehoram said nothing in response to Elisha, perhaps meaning he was willing to wait and see, but the officer who was with Jehoram expressed his unbelief. He said that even if the Lord could make windows in heaven wherein rain could fall, how could what Elisha was saying about abundant crops be true? For crops take time to grow. I find it funny to think that the Lord could make windows in heaven, the rain to appear at his command, but somehow speeding up crop growth would be too much for him. In truth, the officer didn't believe the Lord could make windows in heaven, nor did he believe that crops would be ready the next day even if he did, which is why he said what he said. Elisha said that this man would see the thing from the Lord with his eyes, but he would not taste of it. The likely meaning of this statement, which will be borne out later in the chapter, is that this man would die. Jehoram, though, was agnostic on Elisha's statement, neither believing or disbelieving it, but he obviously was willing to wait until the next day to see if Elisha's statement came true, for he allowed Elisha to live. Coming to verse 3, and we get the rest of the story. What we find is that there were 4 leprous men sitting at the gate of the city. Recall from Leviticus 13, verse 46, that anyone pronounced leprous had to live outside the camp, and when Israel settled in Canaan, that meant outside the gate of the city until they could show themselves clean to the priest of their leprosy. They were not allowed to enter the city. Yet because of this famine, these men were in a predicament. They were hungry. If they went into the city, thus breaking the law of Moses, they wouldn't find any food either, meaning that they would soon perish no matter if they kept or broke the law of Moses. There was one other thing that they thought they could do, though: desert to the Syrians. If the Syrians accepted them, they would eat and live. However, if the Syrians did not accept them, they would die, but death was all but a certainty at that point if they stayed, so why not take a chance with the Syrians? At least if the Syrians killed them, death would be quick, rather than the slow, painful death of starvation. And so that's what these lepers tried to do. Except when they got out to the fields where the Syrians should have been, the Syrians were gone. What had happened? The Lord caused a great noise of chariots and horses to be heard by the Syrians. It seems that only the Syrians could hear this noise. It also seems as if this wasn't the sound of physical horses and chariots, but a miracle done by God to strike fear in the hearts of the Syrians. Perhaps the noise made by the heavenly warriors, similar to what Elisha showed to his servant in chapter 6, is what happened, or perhaps it was something else. We don't know. But what the Syrians thought was that Jehoram was receiving help from the Hittites in the north, who by that time were likely in league with the Assyrians, and the Egyptians in the south. So they fled at twilight. With the Syrians having fled, leaving behind everything, it gave these lepers a chance to take a bounty. They not only took food and drink, but they also took silver, gold, and clothing, items which they hid. After doing this for part of the night, though, their conscience began to bother them that they weren't doing right. In what way? We'll find that out, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 9 to 20, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.